right, thank y'all for coming. I'm Cindy Day, Director here, and we are, as always, in for a treat as Bob talks about the North Carolina Regulators and the Rutherford Trace. Do y'all know anything about either of those? Good.
Good.
Good. I always feel like I always want to take notes when he speaks because I learn so much and I just want to write it down and go back and look at it. Regulator movement came out of Western North Carolina's frustrations with dishonest government in 1768-ish. They protested things like excessive taxes, illegal fees, and other mistreatment of the public. Does that sound familiar? They also resented the lack of representation in government. So during the movement, petitions were brought attention to issues that people wanted those in power to understand and address. About 1770, they interrupted the Hillsborough District court proceedings by occupying the courthouse and targeting county officials. In 1771, Governor Tryon called up the militia and ordered Governor General Hugh Waddell to Hillsborough as a show of force. Then we have the Battle of Alamance occurred after the Regulators refused to disband, and they were eventually defeated and then disbanded afterward. Tryon offered pardons for those who pledged an oath of allegiance to the royal government. And then with the Rutherford Trace, North Carolina General Griffith Rutherford attacked and burned the Cherokee town of Niquosi. It was one of several locations of destruction on what is known as the Rutherford Trace. It was pretty brutal.
Yeah.
The whole thing that he did was just absolutely just brutal. That was an attempt to weaken the Cherokee before they could ally themselves with the British. It was also some retribution by acts by the native people against those moving westward. That town was located in now Macon County, and it was a spiritual and ceremonial center for the Cherokee people. And they were there until about 1819 when they were forced off their lands. So present day Franklin's built on that location thereabouts. That expedition destroyed a lot of Cherokee towns in just a few weeks with food supplies, livestock, food sources, and ending the threat of the Cherokee. So, Bob is a native of North Carolina, third great-grandson of George Plott, who brought the first Plott bear hounds to America in the mid-18th century. He's a great-great-nephew of Henry Plott, who introduced the breed to the Great Smoky Mountains in the early 1800s. He's an author of a number of award-winning books, and he's got several here. He's also received the Order of the Longleaf Pine in 2016, founding member of the Plott Fest, outdoorsman, accomplished wood carver, historian, master storyteller. He is just finished his newest book that will come out in January 2026, The Southern Appalachian Folkways. And this is Gus Plott Day. He carved this for me, and it is an absolute treasure. So I brought Gus with me today.
Thank you.
All right, Bob, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Cindy. It's always a pleasure to be here. Gosh, I don't know how many programs we've done here, but it's one of my favorite places to come to. People are always very attentive and interested and want to learn more, and I always like being around folks like that. For those of you that don't know me, Cindy gave me a great introduction there, but in the end of 2022, I just about died of COVID and pneumonia. I was in the hospital for about a month, intensive care for 2 weeks, had to go through physical therapy to learn how to walk again. Now, I only tell you that is because before that happened, I could just meet somebody the first time I met them, I'd shake hands with them, I could remember their name, I could, dates and numbers and history stuff that I had, I could just rattle it off like that. And I still can especially with the Plott dog stuff. That stuff didn't leave me too much, but some of the historical stuff like today, the stuff we're going to talk about today did, and there's so many dates with that I always bring some notes with me just to make sure I'm giving you the correct information and the correct date and that sort of thing. So I just want to preface that with that, and again, thank you all for coming. But we got a lot of history to cover, and as Cindy kind of prefaced things, this is one of my favorite periods of American history, excuse me, particularly in the South. Between 1760 and about the end of the Revolutionary War in 1781-82, it's one of the most interesting eras, I think. A lot of people know about the Civil War and so much about it, and I enjoy reading about that era too, but there's just so much about this 20, 30-year period that people know very little about. And the truth of the matter is the American Revolution was won here in the South. The British would have probably won the Revolutionary War had it not been for their participation, particularly at the Battle of Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse. And I'll do another whole separate program on that, and maybe I'll come back again in the future and do that. I hope I can. But today we're going to focus on, as Cindy mentioned, the Regulator campaign to a small degree, and to a bigger degree than the Rutherford campaign of 1776. And they're both connected, strangely enough, and it goes to show you the status of America at that time, because Cindy and I have talked a lot about this over the years. People don't understand that the Revolutionary War was truly a civil war. You know, you talk about the Civil War, you know, in the 1860s, North against the South, brother against brother. Certainly that was a civil war, but this was very much the same. You had more, Battle of Kings Mountain, for example, there were only 2 British officers that were certified British citizens at the Battle of Kings Mountain. You had American militia fighting Royalist militia. So it was neighbor against neighbor. So it really was a civil war. The great story here in Caldwell County about a preacher who fought at Kings Mountain, or he was Ferguson's aide. And they gave him Ferguson's whistle when he died, and we talk about that in the other program too. But it's really, this whole area was so interesting during that time. Ann Swan, who lives in Marion, has written a great book, I think it's called Across the River, that talks about the frontier at that time. And that's really what this was. It was the frontier. And when you look at what most of the focus on Revolutionary War history, of course, is in the North. People talking about Bunker Hill, the Declaration of Independence, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Betsy Ross, Paul Revere, all the other people we all know so much about. But there was equally amount of history here, and as I said, really the tide of the war turned because of this in the South. But the seeds of war were planted as early as 1760. And really 1760 and 61, there were 2 major British campaigns led against the Cherokee, the Grant campaign and the Griffin campaign. The Griffin campaign ended in disaster. They were just about massacred. The Grant campaign in 61, I do a whole program about it too, they were able to win because they employed American militia troops. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox of the Civil War, not Civil War, but Revolutionary War, Thomas Sumter, Pickens, all these guys that were really well-known Revolutionary War generals fought there too. And Marion, for example, when they were burning the Cherokee towns, he later wrote in a journal that he saw footprints of little Cherokee children in the fields that they were burning. And he said he wondered what these children would, parents would have to tell their children about these Christians who would come and burn their crops and their fields and all their food and storage in their homes. But starting in the 1760s, really the seed of rebellion was planted then because American citizens were second-class citizens at best. The British had cleverly designed a kind of a boundary. The coastal plain was rich with plantation owners. They were, indigo, rice, cotton, tobacco. They were growing all that, with slaves, of course, working the fields. But they wanted this buffer of what they called white trash, basically, between them and the Cherokee. So they gave land grants to poor people who immigrated to America, Scotch, Irish, Germans, my folks were among those, and who come to settle here in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s. And so they wanted to just basically have these frontiersmen be a buffer between the Indians and them, kind of as a protection. The other thing that worried the British at that time was the population. The white people were very much in the minority. Black people were far out, exceeded the number of blacks in America than whites at that time. And many of them were free, not just slaves, many of them were free men who fought against, their biggest fear, the British's biggest fear was that the Cherokee and the blacks would unite and they knew they would wipe them out if they did. So that was their biggest fear. But at the same time, even though they needed these Americans to defend them, even though they taxed these Americans, even though they required them to fight militia and defend them, they treated them like trash. And this just continued to cause bitterness. These guys were amassing great fortunes, and then the fur trade came in. And the fur trade, I want to talk just a little bit about that. The fur trade began in the early 1700s and was so lucrative by 1716 that the British had appointed the superintendent just to oversee that trade. Now, to give you an idea of how big this was, indigenous tribes like the Cherokee, Shawnee, different tribes throughout the Southeast, they began to covet goods that white people had made, woven goods, jewelry, metal jewelry, guns, bullets, basic stuff such as whiskey, sugar, as well as gunpowder. And so these natives would gladly trade animal hides, in this case deer hides mostly, for these goods. Now, they even implemented a standard system of measurement for trading these goods. And I found this real interesting too. If you wanted a rifle or a musket, it required a trapper to bring 35 tanned deer hides. 1 yard of woven cloth brought 8 hides, an axe or a hatchet, tomahawk, 5 hides, and then if you bought 30 bullets or molded lead musket balls, that was worth 1 deer hide. Now, interestingly, 1 deer hide was worth $1. And that's where the slang term for $1, a buck, originated. You hear people talk about having me borrow a buck. Well, that's where that came from. Of course, a buck being a large male deer that produced a bigger hide. Now, items like gunpowder, cook kettles, and mirrors were in such demand that crooked traders began to get involved with the trading, and that caused more bitterness among the Cherokee too. Now, understandably, this is causing tension now between the Cherokee and the whites. And technically, the British had agreed that there would be no settlement of Cherokee territory. Basically, you had 3 forts, Fort Chiswell in Virginia up near Wytheville, Fort Dobbs down there where Statesville is, and 96 in the upper part of South Carolina. Those were the borders where no white people were supposed to settle beyond that. But a lot of the whites didn't like that idea either. They thought, well, there's good land over there. We'll go over there. I don't care whether the Cherokee are there or not. So this trade began to impact the Cherokee. While they were gaining stuff from the trade, financially, it was hurting them from a cultural standpoint and from a physical standpoint. They were being exposed now to devastation in 3 major categories. One, they'd begun to kill off themselves their own major food sources, deer, sell. They were killing for money. They weren't killing for food and sustenance anymore, so that was going against their whole belief of the circle of life. Secondly, the interaction between the Cherokee and the Europeans resulted in a lot of disease. The Indians had never been exposed to smallpox and things like that just decimated them. Genetically, they had a lower tolerance to alcohol. So it was very, very easy for an Indian to become an alcoholic. So that was another problem. The problem had became so bad that by 1745, the Cherokee chief Skagunsta had wrote a letter to the governor of South Carolina and basically complaining about the tribe's dependence on trade goods. And he wrote, "Our people can no longer live independently from the English. We no longer can make our own weapons, our own ammunition, or our clothes. Every necessity of life comes from the white people." So this was, really concerned him. He saw what it was doing to their culture. Now, to better illustrate the volume of this business, consider this. 1748, the British exported 160,000 deer skins worth $1.25 million to England from Charleston. It was called Charlestown then, but it's Charleston now. 1751, only 2,000 Cherokee hunters produced over 100,000 pounds of deer hides for trade. 1755, the government projected a harvest of 3,500 deer hides in just one trading district alone, placing the total value of Cherokee trade that year at 25,000 skins or hides. Now, assuming that number was the norm and was probably higher than that, between 1739 and 1761, it's safe to say that the Cherokee alone, just the Cherokee, slaughtered over 500,000 deer in those years. Now, a more detailed examination of these records show that the Cherokee killed at least 1 million deer during this period, and more likely closer to 5 million. Now, to be fair, they weren't the only ones hunting them. There were white long hunters or white trappers, but again, they were prohibited legally from doing it. So they could be jailed or fined to do that. So, this was just another cause of friction between the white settlers, and they're saying, well, wait a minute, we're supposed to be out here protecting you. We're supposed to fight for you. You're taxing us, but yet we can't go into this land here that we can just see right over there. That's just not right. Now, you may be asking, what does all this have to do with, sowing the seeds of discontent for the American Revolution? And the answer is simple. These backcountry Americans have been encouraged to live as a buffer and recruited by the Crown to live here. But yet a lot of them were indentured servants. They were given a new chance for life, freedom of religion, escape religious persecution. All of them were encouraged to live here by the Brits, but not only just encouraged, they were required to live on the frontier. In other words, if we brought you here, this is where you're going to live. And this is going to be the most dangerous place, the most difficult place to carve out a living, but this is where you're going to live. Now, in return for agreeing to this dangerous pact, these immigrants were given significant land grants, a good thing, free of charge. On surface, again, this seemed like a good thing, but they also had to pay taxes, and they were expected to serve in the militia. And but yet they were considered second-class citizens, not allowed to settle beyond these boundaries. They had as Cindy said, they were being taxed. They had very few rights at all. Now, more than a few settlers ignored this law and went and settled in the Cherokee Crown, or in the Cherokee country, which again caused tension between the Cherokee and the British. So now, all these things factored in, there's this daily tension growing between the British and the Americans. Now, things were no different in the Piedmont of North Carolina, where in the mid-1760s, a group was formed known as the Regulators. Now, the Regulators was a name given to American patriots who opposed British rule, taxation, and laws. They were so named because of their desire to regulate their own affairs by establishing fair laws and ending corruption and unfair taxes by the British. Plus, the term regulator was a real derogatory term in England. That was a kind of an insulting, it was kind of one of the worst things you could call somebody. So, as Cindy mentioned, the Regulator Rebellion actually began in 1766 and lasted until 1771. And basically, in the simplest terms, these North Carolina backcountry citizens took up arms against the British government, and what did they want? They wanted honest government. They wanted less taxes. They didn't want to be discriminated against. They wanted the same rights as the low country elite had, which was fair. Now, this conflict raged on between 1776 and 1771, culminating in the Battle of Alamance on May 16th, 1771, near present-day Burlington, North Carolina. Now, the British sent provincial militia led by Griffin Rutherford, Francis Nash, and Richard Caswell to quell this rebellion, and Hugh Waddell, as Cindy mentioned. And they soundly defeated the rebels. Later, they captured 12 of them. They were given the opportunity to swear an allegiance to the crown. 6 of them agreed to do it, 6 of them didn't, and the 6 that didn't were hung. So these guys, they were hanging their neighbors. Now, the thing that's really ironic here is that both Francis Nash and Rutherford would later play prominent roles as military leaders for the Americans in the American Revolutionary War. And Richard Caswell would be a member of the First Continental Congress and help draft the United States Constitution. But yet at this time, they were fighting for the British, just 10 years before the Revolutionary War began. Now, we'll come back to talk a little bit more about the Regulator campaign in a minute, but I think it's probably a good point right now to take a closer look at Rutherford, because we're going to talk about him with the 1776 campaign too. seems hard to believe how he could kill and hang his own neighbors in defense of the British Crown, but yet less than 10 years later be fighting against these same people. But he was born in Ireland in 1721. His parents moved to America when he was a small child, but they died at sea, and he was raised by relatives as an orphan in Pennsylvania. He never had much education. He could read and write barely, but not much more than that. But he was very, very intelligent. By all accounts, he grew up very hard on the frontier, was known to be a pretty high-tempered fella. He was, as an adult, he stood about 5'8" tall, not a real big guy. Of course, not many real big guys back in those days. And he was described as having a muscular frame and a head full of fiery red hair. I guess kind of along with his Irish heritage there. But like I said, he was very intelligent. He moved to Halifax County, North Carolina in 1750 from Pennsylvania, and later to Rowan County in 1753. Here he served as a captain under Colonel Hugh Waddell's Rangers, who operated out of Fort Dobbs, which is right outside Statesville. They got a real nice replica of the fort built there now. This unit was well-known fighting unit. They dressed and fought like Indians. They wore moccasins, leggings, buckskins, and they were feared by the Cherokee counterparts. Rutherford also fought at Fort Duquesne, saw heavy combat there during the French and Indian War, and later after the war he claimed a 656-acre parcel of land that became known as the Irish settlement because of his Irish background. His skills as a surveyor made him a valuable man to the planter class, the rich elite. And as I told Cindy earlier, the more I did research about this, Rutherford was just a rogue. I mean, he was a patriot in a lot of ways and was heroic in a lot of ways, but he was not above cheating people and doing what he could to make money illegally. He falsified land claims that he had surveyed to other people's benefit or to his own benefit. And between his huge farm, 756-acre farm, all manned by slaves, and his illegal dealings, by 1765, he was a very wealthy man. He further increased his income by becoming a prominent member of a group of crooked politicians that were known as the courthouse ring. And these guys used their law to their financial gain, often at the expense of the common man. And this is kind of where we go back to the regulator campaign again. By 1776, these Americans had enough. You know, they were like, look, man, we are just getting beat on all angles here. You know, we can't win. So they rebelled against the Crown. As Cindy said, they occupied the courthouse. There were several skirmishes at Morse Creek, different places. And interestingly enough, most of the time there were enough of the regulators that in most cases they outnumbered the British militia, but they didn't have the weapons, the same amount of weapons and the same amount of technical training, so to speak. But again, their main issues were less taxes, less corrupt politicians, a freedom to live their lives as they please. That's what they came to America for. That's what they wanted to, that's what they expected. They called themselves regulators because they wanted to regulate their own laws. So the governor of North Carolina sent Waddell, Colonel Hugh Waddell and Rutherford, among several others, to lead these campaigns against the regulators. The regulators were primarily led by a guy named Herman Husband and Ben Merrill. And as Cindy said, the rebellion culminated in the Battle of Alamance, which took place on May 16, 1771, near Big Alamance Creek, near present-day Burlington, North Carolina. The battle was 2 hours long. There were 2,000 regulators versus about 1,200 British. So here again, there were more Americans than there were British. Of course, really both of them were Americans. But the Brits were far better armed. They had cannon, they had a lot more better weapons. They lost 26 killed in action and had 61 wounded. The regulators lost 100 killed in action and 200 wounded. The battle and the aftermath effectively ended the regulator rebellion. There were 12 Americans captured, as I mentioned earlier, and they were ordered to be hung. 6 were pardoned, but the other 6 were hung. So again, here were Americans hanging Americans. And of course, this only added insult to injury and further fed the flames of the war. And again, keep in mind, this is 10 years before the American Revolution. So many surviving regulators moved west. They went ahead and moved into what's now East Tennessee or up in this area, McDowell County, Burke County, that area. The land barons were buying Cherokee land illegally, which led to regular raids on the western frontier. Land was cheap, but dangerous to defend there. In March 1775, in Sycamore Shoals, Tennessee, near present-day Elizabethton, the Daniel Boone and Richard Henderson was a big land regulator. They met with the Cherokee there, and actually the Shawnee were there too, and the Shawnee had sold Cherokee land and got all kinds of prizes for it, cloth, clothes, jewelry, whiskey, whatever. And this was, this was illegal. This was violating British law in 1775. And the great great Cherokee chief Dragging Canoe, we'll talk about more in a little bit, he warned the British. He said, you'll get this land, but it will prove to be a dark and bloody ground. And it did. Even though the Rutherford campaign, which we'll talk about in a second, slowed down the Cherokee oppression on the war on the frontier, the year of 1777 would be called the year of the Bloody Sevens, because there were so many people killed on the frontier. Now it's interesting that in March 1775, the Mecklenburg Resolves were written by a group of patriots near present-day Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, you may have heard about the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which is why Charlotte's called the Hornet's Nest, or why they have a team called the Hornets, because these Americans were discontented with the British, and they were kind of stirring up the Hornet's Nest, so to speak. Now, there's a lot of historians have done a study on the Declaration of Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. Based on what I can see, I don't think it was authentic. I think that's kind of a folk tale. Other people say, no, it's 100% true. North Carolina State commissioned a huge study on it and pretty much proved that it wasn't. But, again, that's up for the discussion. However, the Mecklenburg Resolves are 100% correct. They are well documented. And they were written by two guys named Thomas Polk and Ephraim Brevard. They were two American patriots living near present-day Charlotte in 1775. Now their document, the Mecklenburg Resolves, declared all British rule and laws are null and void. They demanded the end of taxes, they demanded self-rule, and they outlined the selection process for officials and a meeting schedule for the same thing. This was basically a prelude to the American Constitution. It was almost exactly what the American Constitution was later. So now keep in mind, nobody talks about this, but this is happening here in North Carolina in 1775. But again, not very little is ever talked about this. So as I said, the resolves were published a full year before the Declaration of Independence, and they were published in full in the newspaper at that time. The biggest newspaper in North Carolina at that time, really anywhere around, was the North Carolina Gazette. And it was published in the North Carolina Gazette on June 16th, 1775. So documented fact there. Now again, going back to what I said earlier, I think it's interesting that almost none of these items have ever been talked about. Or, if you do, you hear about it in things like what we're doing today. But we'll go back to Rutherford now. Sometime by 1776, this guy who had stolen all the land from American common men, who had fought against American common men, now all of a sudden he becomes a champion of the American common man. He had a radical change of heart and became a colonel in the local militia, American militia near Salisbury, North Carolina, when the Revolutionary War began in 1776. He started out as a captain actually, then became a colonel. By 1776, he'd been promoted to the brigadier general of the Salisbury district. Now, his biggest concern then, and rightfully so, was there was a large number of attacks taking place on the frontier at that time. And at that point in time, about the furthest west white people lived on North Carolina was Old Fort, what present-day Old Fort, Davidson's Fort was there then. And that was basically the boundary line. You weren't supposed to go beyond that to settle. So Ann Swan, who lives in Marion, has written a great book, I think it's called Across the River, about the frontier at that time in McDowell, Burke County, and talks about the number of forts, the number of little stockades and stuff that were raided during that period of time. So this leads us to the Rutherford Campaign of 1776. The war in the North is raging now with British Army regulars and ragtag American Army and militia. But here in the South, the concern was none of that. We weren't fighting any of the, British troops at that point in time, not yet. We were dealing with Indian attacks. That was the bigger concern, was Indian attacks. So in 1776, just to give you an idea of what the state of the Cherokee were at that time, they reigned supreme here. There were 36,000 Cherokee living in a 140,000 square mile region that included what's now western North Carolina, upstate South Carolina, East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, and North Georgia, and even into northern Alabama. And they they were a formidable force, because up until this time, they had never really been beaten. The only time that they had ever taken any sort of close to a defeat was at Cowie Pass in the Grant campaign. But before that, they had really fine, fierce warriors that were great strategists. Ostenaco, Oconostota, and Dragon Canoe, to name three of them. And they could lay legitimate claim to doing something that no American Indian tribe has ever done in American history, in that they had defeated a major British Army campaign led by General Grant in 1760, nearly killed them all at Cowie Pass. They'd also captured a British fort, Fort Loudon in East Tennessee, and both of this was done entirely under Cherokee warriors, Cherokee lawyers, led by Cherokee leadership. There may have been a handful of white traders living with them, but there was no, in other words, most of the other, like the Braddock's defeat during the French and Indian War, they were heavily supplemented by French troops. Here, this was strictly Cherokee beating the colonists, hands down. So, like I said, other fort battles such as Fort Necessity, Braddock's defeat, have been won by natives in the past, but only with French help, Allied help. After the Grant campaign in 1761, the Cherokee had agreed to kind of a truce, so to speak. They both agreed that neither one of them could beat the other one, so we'll just set this boundary up. We'll have the fort at 96 in upstate South Carolina. We'll have Fort Dobbs, Fort Dobbs, Old Fort, Davidson's Fort and Old Fort, and we'll have Fort Chiswell up near Wytheville, Virginia. Whites won't go past that. Everything else west of that, north of that, is Cherokee or Shawnee territory. Now, this didn't stop the Americans from breaking the law. Most notably, we made the aforementioned Sycamore Shoals Treaty. But small forts and stockades were built from Salisbury to Davidson's Fort to, repel the Cherokee. But they were being raided daily. Almost daily, you could find reports of somebody's kids being kidnapped, or some woman or man being killed in the fields by a random Cherokee raiding party, that sort of thing. And these situations seemed to worsen daily, so much so that in early 1776, the governor of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, 3 governors, authorized an expedition to destroy the Cherokee in western North Carolina. Now, what they decided to do, there were going to be 3 divisions. All militia. The North Carolina contingent would be led by General Griffin Rutherford. The South Carolina division would be led by Major Andrew Williamson, and the Virginia militia would be commanded by Colonel William Christian. Rutherford would serve as the overall commander of the army, which eventually totaled over 4,000, almost 5,000 men, making it the largest militia campaign in American history ever. So again, there's nothing even close to this in terms of militia campaigns size. Again, something you don't ever hear about. Excuse me. As Cindy said, their plan was simple and it was brutal. They were ready to fight. They certainly had enough weapons and they certainly had enough men to fight any number of the Cherokee, but their goal was they wanted to destroy the Cherokee Nation. They were going to do it in the fall. They were leaving just about this time of year. This is about the time of year when this campaign took place 250 years ago. But the plan was simple. The Virginia militia would march south and attack the Overhill Cherokee tribes. Cherokee villages. A very small group of Georgians, supplemented by Rutherford's North Carolina Army, would march north and attack the towns in North Georgia and North Carolina. And then Rutherford would march from the Piedmont up through the upstate South Carolina and rendezvous with Rutherford in western North Carolina. Now, the militia really had no idea what they were going to face in regards to a fight. Based on their past experience with Grant and Griffin, they probably expected to be ambushed or face some pretty hard combat. They certainly believed they would be fighting a lot. They certainly had every reason to believe that was true because that's what had happened to them up until now. But in this case, they were prepared to fight if they had to, but now their goal was simple. They wanted to burn down every village, they wanted to burn down their crops in the field, and they wanted to burn down the storehouses that had their food. So what they were going to do in effect was basically kill them, give them a slow death, because now winter would be coming on. They had nothing to eat, they had nowhere to live, they had small children. You know, it's coming winter time, there's not going to be as much hunting as usual. They don't have any crops, don't have anything stored, so they're going to starve to death. You know, and they didn't have time to build anything back up. So it was a, you know, I've heard this described as the Cherokee Holocaust, and really it was, if you think about it from that perspective, because they were going to have nothing but the clothes on their back when this was over. So in July 1st, 1776, 250 years ago, Rutherford began recruiting men for the militia in Salisbury, North Carolina. In just a few days, he'd signed up 2,500 men, and he spent the rest of the month outfitting them, making sure they had everything they needed for the campaign. They left Salisbury on August 1st, as did the divisions from the other states, so they're all kind of coming into a three-pronged center. There were two more rally points for North Carolina troops. Cathy's Fort, which is in McDowell County, site of it. It's east of present-day Route 221 and Hankins Road. The original fort was built on a hill on the north side of Catawba River. The other rally point was Davidson's Fort near present-day Old Fort, and there's a reconstruction version of that fort there today that you can visit. So by Rutherford's men, now close to 2,600, camped at Pleasant Gardens, North Carolina, which is not too far from here, in late August. And they headed west on the morning of September 1st. So again, about 250 years ago, almost this very same time, or exactly the same time, they were heading west. Same day, Williamson's South Carolina contingent left, and he left 300 of his men to reinforce the old fort at Seneca, South Carolina. And then he took another 2,000 men to meet Rutherford. So now, when those join together, that's going to take you up to 4,600 men right there. Now this is interesting, a lot of people don't know about this either, but on September 19th, the South Carolina militia were ambushed by 300 Cherokee and 50 British Loyalists in present-day Macon County, North Carolina, in a steep gorge that was known as the Black Hole. These South Carolina men were supplemented by 100 Catawba Indian scouts or rangers in their ranks, and they were led by Captain Sam Boykin. The Catawbas and his rangers were instructed to wear bucktails, deer tails, in their hair on their hats to differentiate them between the Cherokee so they wouldn't be shot by their own men. This battle of the Black Hole lasted for 2 hours and involved fierce hand-to-hand combat. The Patriot force had 12 militia and 1 Indian scout killed, and there were 24 militia and 2 Indian, 24 wounded and 24 militia wounded and 2 Indian scouts wounded. Now, the interesting thing about this battle was there were several famous leaders on both sides of this battle. On the Patriot side, you had Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens, among others. And on the Cherokee side, you have Oconostota, Ostonaco, and Dragon Canoe. So let's take a little quick look at all 3 of them, or really all 5 of them, because they were really interesting guys too. Thomas Sumter was born in Virginia in 1734. He fought at Braddock's defeat in the French and Indian War, and he became a renowned fighter in the Revolutionary War. He was nicknamed the Fighting Gamecock. He was a guide for Lieutenant Henry Timberlake's expedition to the Cherokee in 1761. And again, this is another very little known event. This Henry Timberlake was a British officer who had been sent to visit all the Cherokee towns. He didn't know anything about it. So he had these experienced Americans, excuse me, Sumter being one of them, as his guide. One of the chiefs that he visited was Ostenaco in 1762, and he took Sumter and Timberlake took Ostenaco back to Williamsburg to meet with the American government there. And while in Williamsburg, he met Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson later was quoted as saying that the chief was the greatest orator he'd ever heard. He said he'd never heard anybody that could speak like this guy. He said he was just so eloquent and articulate. Sumter, kind of like Rutherford, was a bit of a rogue, and he was imprisoned as a debtor in 1766. Joseph Martin, a famous Indian agent, got Sumter out of prison with some money and a tomahawk. There's an interesting story behind that. But Sumter later moved to upstate South Carolina, where he became a very prominent landowner and slaveholder, became very rich. He fought at the Black Hole Battle, but was sent back to South Carolina before the campaign went further. So he didn't actually go into any further than that with the Rutherford campaign. But he fought all over the South during the Revolutionary War and died in 1832 at the age of 97. And at that time, he was the last surviving general of the American Revolutionary War. Andrew Pickens was known as the Wizard Owl by the Cherokee. If you ever saw a painting of him, you'd see, because he looked like a big bird. He had a real long nose and kind of an unusual looking guy. But he was born in 1739 in Pennsylvania. He moved to Virginia as a child and to South Carolina in the early 1760s. He became a rich plantation owner. His plantation there was called Hopewell, and it was known throughout the region as one of the biggest and nicest plantations there. He fought all over the state during the war, the Revolutionary War. He fought at the Battle of Cowpens. He fought at Augusta, the siege in 96, Battle of Eutaw Springs. He fought with the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, and both Francis Marion and Pickens had fought on the Griffin expeditions and the Grant expeditions of 1760 and 1761. So these were seasoned fighters, frontier fighters. Ostenaco, Dragon Canoe, and Conestoga are arguably the finest war chiefs in Cherokee history. As I said, Ostenaco was known as a fine orator and diplomat. He later traveled actually to London with Timberlake to visit with the king. Conestoga was called the Great Warrior of Chota, Chota being the town that he lived in. And again, he holds the distinction of being the only Native American leader to ever defeat the British Army and to take a British fort. So again, very prominent, seasoned fighter. He was a big, muscular man, had a scarred face from smallpox. He really hated all white people. He tolerated the French simply because they seemed to be more interested just in trade and not taking land, but he didn't like them either. And he said that he feared no man or no nation, and that included King George and all his forces. And he was really well known. You know, a lot of the Indians fought just kind of every man on his own. Once I got whatever I needed, I went back home. He really was able to command the Cherokee in such a way that they were like a true military force. And so he had a lot of success because of that. And then you got Dragon Canoe. Dragon Canoe was the youngest of the war chiefs. He was a son of Attacullaculla, also called the Little Carpenter. Attacullaculla was the totally opposite. You can see a father and son, two complete 180-degree opposites. Here was Attacullaculla, who was this little tiny, skinny man who just was all about peace. All he cared about was promoting peace. And his son, all he cared about was killing. He wanted to fight everybody that moved. He did not care. And he was a big, strong guy. And he would be a fierce enemy of all white settlers the rest of his life. Even after the Revolutionary War, when the Cherokee had signed all the treaties and it kind of calmed things down, he formed a splinter group called the Chickamauga Cherokees that were based out of near Chattanooga, Tennessee today. And he fought the whites until 1792, and when he died. So, Rutherford, even with his massive army behind him, he had his work cut out for him because these were the guys that he was going up against. And they had a great deal of experience fighting, and they'd had a great deal of success fighting. And that's one thing I wonder about this when I've studied this is, as you'll see when we're getting into shortly, there never was a lot of real battles during this conflict. And I've often wondered why. I mean, there were multiple places where they could have ambushed, where they could have tried to done damage as they had done everywhere else that they had fought, but they didn't, for the most part. So on September 1st, 1776, Rutherford now had 3,000 men, and he left Pleasant Garden Camp in McDowell County and headed west. Now, interestingly enough, the route he would follow, and if you've ever been, I know all of you have, I don't think there's probably not a county in western North Carolina where there's not one of those state historical markers with a Rutherford Trace campaign, because that's basically where it was. But he followed the route would be almost identical to I-40 today. They left Old Fort, Davidson's Fort, followed I-40 up to, well, not I-40, but that was the trail that would later be I-40, to the gap up there, Swannanoa Gap, down into the Swannanoa River Valley, where present-day Black Mountain is, Asheville, that sort of thing. When they got to what would be now Canton, they took a left and followed the Pigeon River along that route all the way out to about where 215 is, and then turned up across the Pigeon Gap, came down into Waynesville, present-day Waynesville, and then got, again, the trail would follow the site of the present-day Great Smoky Mountains Expressway, a 4-lane road that goes all the way into Cherokee. They would follow that to Dillsboro, North Carolina, turn left there and go into Franklin, what's near Franklin, where the Hiawassee, the major Cherokee town, was. And then they went on along the Little Tennessee River, back through Swain County, back to the holy town of Katua in Swain County, and then looped back around and basically returned home the same way they came. So it's basically just taking a big, heading west and taking a big loop and then coming back east again. So Rutherford intended to rendezvous with Williamson's 2,000 men at Hiawassee. So they connected at Hiawassee on September 26th, 1776. So again, this is exactly the same time frame as we are today, back 250 years ago. So on September 26th, Griffin now had 4,500 men under his command, and they included 1,400 drovers and pack horses, by far the largest American militia campaign ever in history. Their path of destruction began in tribal towns near present-day Macon, and it was just a scorched earth campaign. As I said, their intent was to destroy and burn everything. They didn't want to leave anything, council houses, storage, food storage, crops, anything. And a lot of people don't know this, but the Cherokee lived in log cabins. They didn't live in teepees or wigwams. They lived very much the same way that American frontiersmen lived. They had log cabins, they had a council house where they had their meetings. They were very matriarchal society in that they really valued women's opinion. Women had a voice in their government. They were very diplomatic in that way. And of course they farmed. They had corn, beans, same kind of crops that the Americans were used to. So this was just devastating on so many different levels of how, again, it was, I guess in hindsight, you can look at it and say it was really smart to do it this way, I guess, but it was brutal, harsh, because it's hard telling how many people starved to death, how many people died because of this. But after destroying several of the lower, middle, and overhill towns, the Army headed northwest in what is now Swain County, following the Little Tennessee, turned east, and then turned their targets on Big Bear's village, which was near Bryson City, present-day Bryson City, and then they went and destroyed the holy town of Katua. Now, the significance of Katua is huge. It wasn't the biggest town in the Cherokee nation, but it was sacred, holy town. Cherokee believed this is where it's kind of like the Cherokee Garden of Eden. They believed this is where their whole culture, their whole family originated. right along the Tuckasegee River. So to destroy this town would be the equivalent of, to a Protestant army coming in and destroying Mecca for the Muslims or Jerusalem for the Jews. It had that same sort of significance. Meanwhile, Rutherford had employed a separate quick strike cavalry force of about 100 mounted horsemen and destroyed 5 more Cherokee villages just in rapid fire attacks. By early October, the militia had destroyed over 36 villages or towns. And most of this foot militia then headed back home safely, following the same route back to Davidson's Fort. They only lost 5 men during this whole campaign, and 1 was wounded by friendly fire. Perhaps because of those large numbers, maybe that's why the Cherokee didn't resist or to any stronger degree. I don't know. That's one thing I still find perplexing, considering the success they had enjoyed in earlier campaigns. Why didn't they put up more of a fight? I don't know. But their losses as far as killed in action were minimal too. They basically at best they could account for, there were 60 Cherokee killed. There were 12 hostages taken. There may have been more than that because the Cherokees were really good at getting their dead and wounded off the field, but not much more, I'm sure. In early October, Rutherford launched another quick strike cavalry campaign, again taking about 100 horsemen under his command, and made quick strike attacks until October 16th, when this time now they finally, I guess, had thought, okay, we got to do something. Ostenaco and Oconostota basically attacked his cavalry, and despite a brief fierce battle, neither side really suffered any serious losses there. Rutherford launched another cavalry attack on the tribe and fought with Ostenaco and Oconostota again on November 16th, which again, minimal losses. So the Cherokee withdrew to regroup for the winter because now they had to find a way to get some food, get some shelter for their families. They had no choice but to do that. Now there was a young Cherokee boy who was living among the tribe at that time named Yanaguska. And Yanaguska later became a great Cherokee chief himself, and in fact, he adopted Will Thomas, a young white boy, and thanks to Yanaguska and Will Thomas, they basically saved the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears. Even though many of them were sent to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, Will Thomas bought land, deeded it in his name, and let the Cherokee live on it, and that became the Qualla boundary, the Cherokee Indian Reservation today. So Yanaguska, as a small boy, he'd worked with Thomas to do this. So as a small boy, Yanaguska had seen his towns burned by several times during his lifetime. And as an old man, he was living in a village near Soco Gap, North Carolina, and a missionary approached him and told him that she was telling him about the Christian Bible. And so Yanaguska said that he'd like to learn more about it. He couldn't read, but he'd like to learn more about it. And he asked the missionary, he said, I'll pay you to read this Bible to me because I want to learn more about it. And Yanaguska took it serious. He didn't, when he said, I want you to read it to me, he sat down with him and he went by verse. And he'd stop and ask him a question about the verse and go back. And it took him 2 years to go through it. So they went through 2 entire years of really studying the Bible, and Yanaguska probably knew the Bible as well as anybody ever has. Anyway, at the end of that 2-year period, somebody approached Yanaguska and said, it's wonderful what you've done. You've studied the white man's Bible. I'm sure you feel like you're better for it. What do you think of this great book? And he said, well, it truly is an amazing book. It's just amazing to me that the white men aren't any better for having had it so long. So that's always one of my favorite quotes. But back to the campaign there, Yanaguska had seen all these things. All the Cherokee had seen all these things and experienced all these things. So there would be scattered Indian raids across the frontier until the 1790s, but the Rutherford campaign's brutal scorched earth expedition basically ended any real threat of the tribe again. There would be random attacks from that point on. And like I said, particularly the Chickamauga Cherokee with East Tennessee, Kentucky, continued to have fierce fighting all the way up till the end of the Revolutionary War. Like I said, 1777 was the year of the Bloody Sevens in Tennessee and Kentucky, but not so much in North Carolina. But as I said, the tribe had no time to fight that fall. They were focused on finding food and shelter to survive, and it would prove to be one of the longest, hardest winters in North Carolina history, so that further complicated things. As I said, Dragon Canoe and his Chickamaugas continued to terrorize the frontier for another 2 decades, but now the Indian Wars in western North Carolina were basically over. Rutherford would go on to serve valiantly for the Patriot cause in the Revolutionary War. He led several more smaller militia attacks against the Cherokee in coming years. He later fought at the Battle of Ramseur's Mill. He also fought at the Battle of Camden, where he was wounded and captured by the British. He was released by a prisoner of war exchange in 1781, and he led several militia campaigns against his old adversary, Dragon Canoe, in late 1781 until Dragon Canoe's death in 1792. In the 1790s, he became a politician. Kind of fitting for a rogue guy like that, I guess. He ran for the governor of North Carolina, but did not win. And so he later moved to Sumter County, Tennessee, where he prospered. He had a big plantation and a farm there, was active in his community, and he died in 1805 at the age of 84. Now, he was no doubt an interesting character and at times downright dishonest, but his service to the Revolutionary War, especially in the Rutherford campaign, played a huge but little known role in winning the war for the Patriot cause. Most historians, and a lot of really historians far more skilled than me and far more knowledgeable than me, have studied this campaign, and they agree that had the Rutherford campaign not happened, the Cherokee and Shawnee would have continued to control the frontier with the British allies, and having that two-pronged attack working against you, Cherokee and Shawnee here, British in the north, there was probably no way that the Americans could have won the war. So that really kind of laid the foundation for Americans' victory, and then really paved the way for Kings Mountain. And again, we do a whole separate program on Kings Mountain, Guilford Courthouse, and Cowpens, which again were the turning points of the war, literally. So, as I said, hopefully we can come back and talk about those 3 battles, because that's interesting too. And a lot of these same guys that were in the Rutherford campaign fought in a lot of those battles too, particularly Kings Mountain. So it's interesting to me too that one thing that happened on the Rutherford campaign was you had these close to 5,000 men that were seeing all this country they'd never seen before. And so having them in that situation, the first thing they did when they got back home was, that's where we're going. And that's why this area started filling up, because the Cherokee weren't nearly as much of a threat. My family were living down around in the Catawba County area at that time, right after the war. And my great-great-uncle Henry Plott went to Haywood County in 1805, followed exactly the same route that the Rutherford campaign did when he moved to Haywood County. So it really laid the groundwork for the winning of the Revolutionary War, kind of common thing. The frontier, there would be activity on the frontier till, like I said, the 1790s, but nothing major. So that's really, again, like I say, really laid the groundwork for the end of the Revolution, the American victory, and then of course really laid the foundation for Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse. But we can talk about that another day. Anybody got any questions? I'll wrap it up with that.
When they burned all the crops and the houses and the settlements and stuff, where did they go?
Caves, woods, wherever they could hide. There's a really great place near Franklin, North Carolina. It's really heartbreaking to go in, but it's in the National Forest, and it's this huge cave. It's the biggest cave I've ever seen. And it faces south toward Georgia, so you got this view for miles where you could see anybody coming towards you. But inside that cave, there was a spring in the cave, so there was a water source. And you could probably sleep 250 people in there. It's that big. So they found places like that. If you go over in Nantahala Gorge, where the Nantahala Outdoor Center and rafting and all that stuff is now, all along the right side of the river, the Nantahala River. There's caves all along up there where they hid. Up in what's now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park above Bryson City, again, a whole network of caves. So there was plenty of, certainly not a good way of living, but it put a shelter over your head and you could build a fire.
What they eat?
Whatever they could find. If they, at that time, bears were hibernating by then. Deer were still out, so they could kill deer, squirrels, rabbits, fish, Cherokees were famous for making fish traps, where you can see a lot of them along the rivers now, where they would get stoned and making kind of a V, and the current would pull the fish in there, and they'd go in and get them out. So they just, they had to live, but they had no vegetables, which is, they, in a lot of ways, they introduced corn to Americans. A lot of Americans hadn't seen, Caucasian invaders, so to speak, had never seen corn until the Indians showed them about it, for the most part. So it was, it was, like I said, it was a Holocaust for them, because a lot of them starved to death. A lot of them got sick, froze. It was just, it was brutal in all ways. And, I guess, like I say, from a strategic standpoint, you accomplished what you wanted to accomplish without losing many people. So, they saw it as a big victory, and in that sense it was. But it was certainly brutal. And, but both sides were brutal. There was atrocities on both sides, and Americans started scalping really before a lot of the Cherokee tribes did. Governor of South Carolina and North Carolina had bounties for scalps. So a lot of guys made money, bringing in scalps. And a lot of times they didn't care. The more corrupt ones didn't care as long as it had black hair. They didn't care if it was a white person or Indian they killed. So, yeah, it was rough times. Any other questions?
One other thing, you were talking about growing gardens somewhere along the way. When you said they grew indigo?
Yeah, and the,
What does indigo look like? I don't.
I tell you the truth, they use, what it's used for. I know what it's used for. It grows in water, so it's basically, marshy areas in the south were really good for that. As I understand, it's kind of stalky looking, almost like a cane, but they got that indigo blue and a lot of the dye from it.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. The primary thing was cotton, and tobacco. And like I said, all that was slave driven. And as I said before, there was a surprising amount of freed blacks that were fighting. They were publishing newspapers and publishing pamphlets saying, rise up, this is an opportunity for us. And of course, several of them were hung, Several of them escaped and formed kind of outlaw bands on the Cherokee border, and some of them went and lived with the Cherokee. One of the biggest fears that the Americans or British had, there was a German missionary named Christian Pryber who went and lived with the Cherokee in the 1750s, 40s, 50s. Right, it was before the French and Indian War. And he was really fascinated with the Cherokee. He really liked how they did things. He liked how they were a matriarchal society, how they treated women. And but he knew enough about European culture that he taught them best ways they could fight the British and the Americans. And so the British declared him an outlaw. They put a bounty on his head and said he was a French spy. He wasn't, but they finally, captured him and killed him. But he was not many people know about him, but a really, really interesting guy. Any other questions? Feel free to shoot. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the name Will Thomas,
Mm-hmm.
the boy that was raised by,
Yanaguska.
was William Holland Thomas?
That's him.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
That was him, okay.
Yeah, if you go into, his house is still standing, and in fact, I know the people are living in it there near Whittier.
Okay.
He was an interesting guy. He fought in the Cherokee and the Civil War, had the Thomas's Cherokee Legion, had all Cherokee. Quill Rose and a few other white guys were in there. There were some white guys in there, but it was mostly Cherokee. And they fought, actually the last battle of the Civil War was outside of Waynesville, North Carolina with his guys. But he had been a prominent politician in North Carolina. He was very was a big force behind getting the railroad into Western North Carolina. That sixth book we wrote, a lot of people don't understand Western North Carolina was like a state of frontier to really the late 1800s because there was any railroads. Railroads ended at Old Fort. So in 1871 or 2, they decided to build a railroad from Old Fort to Murphy, and it took 20 years to do it. And so it didn't get done until 1892. And to give you an idea about that, they completed the entire Transcontinental Railroad in 4 years. It took 20 years to build this. But it was because it's such, rough land. But Thomas was a big proponent for that. He didn't live to see it. The railroad actually goes right by his house today. But he died, he contracted some different types of social diseases, and he went crazy. And he would go he would have different types of, he'd go for periods of time where he'd be lucid, and he'd go for periods of time where he'd just be completely out of his head. He spent a lot of time at the insane asylum in Morganton before his death. But a real interesting guy, and like I said, Yanaguska hired him to run a trading post for him when he was 12 years old, and adopted him because his father had died, his mother was really struggling, so he was doing his best to take care of her. And so he became a lawyer and a farmer, and of course the Civil War officer. Really, there's been some good books written about him, but a really interesting guy. And like I said, had not been for he and Yanaguska, I'm breaking it down very simply, but it was a little bit more complicated than this, but they'd already started sending Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, and Solly had already killed an American soldier, so he had to be executed. But Yanaguska and Thomas, basically, Yanaguska was an advisor to Thomas because Yanaguska had no power as an Indian, but Thomas basically bought all the land in his name and then signed it back over to the tribe, and that's what that's the Qualla boundary today. So if it had not been for him, they'd have all had to go to Oklahoma. And of course, those same caves that they hid out during the Revolutionary War on the Rutherford campaign, they hid out during the Trail of Tears too. I've been in some of those caves where you can see fire pits and drawings, on the walls. Real hard to get to. Not many people know where they are, and I don't tell many people where they are. But like I said, that one cave in there outside of Franklin, there's 250 people could sleep in it easy, and you had a water source right there too. But Thomas, interesting guy. William Holland Thomas, that was his name. He's got a big rock house on the left as you go on that Great Smoky Mountains Expressway. You can see it on the left there, and there's a road marker that says William Holland Thomas. And that Thomas Divide, there's a trail that runs in through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's called the Thomas Divide Trail, and it's named after him.
How interesting Yanaguska was when he died and how he died?
He was old. I wrote about him in one of my books. I have to look it up. He like some of the Cherokee, he had an alcohol problem. And so as long as but he had actually, passed out from I guess he went into almost a coma from a alcohol overdose. And they thought he was dead. And they left him alone for about a day or two thinking he had died, and they were getting ready to prepare the body to bury him, and he woke back up. And I've been told, that changed him. That was kind of like, I got my do-over now. I'm going to make sure I make the best of it, And so to my knowledge, best I can understand, he never drank anymore after that. But he lived in a little village. He's buried, I sort of know where, but can't say exactly where, but it's Soco Gap as you cross into the Qualla boundary. When I was a little boy, my aunt ran our Cherokee Indian Museum. And of course, at that time, now it's in downtown Cherokee, but at that time it was out on US 19. and there was an older Cherokee man there named Moses Owl that I got to be friends with when I was 5, 6 years old. And he made a blowgun for me, traditional Cherokee blowgun, scaled it down to my size. I still got it. But he really had a huge impact on my life in telling me, because he told me he was a Baptist member of the Baptist church, but he believed in still the old ways. He believed there was an upper world and a middle world where we lived, and an underworld, which was hell basically. And he had a real good concept as far as, or I thought it was good, as far as, you weren't that, when you got put in the middle world to live, you were on your own. God created you, the creators, they call it, created you, but you were on your own. And if what you did good, that was on you. If you did bad, that was on you. The results of that would depend on where you spent the afterlife. But they didn't believe that there was this, they believed in a creator, but they didn't believe that creator was watching everything that they did and dictating to them what they did. It was like, you do it, he's leaving you alone. You know what you're supposed to do, that's what you got to do, and if you don't do it, then you'll pay the consequence. And he all had some interesting theories as to why. I had a young friend that died of leukemia when he was like 6 or 7 years old, and I just couldn't understand that. How could that be fair? And he had the idea that some people lived longer because they had to live longer to accumulate knowledge, but there were some people that were basically pretty much born perfect, and that they didn't need to live that much longer. So I like that. So that was. But he introduced me to Yanaguska. He was the first person I'd ever heard about Yanaguska from, when he was telling me stories about Yanaguska, and that really fascinated me and made me think about that. And I had such great experiences at that time. Really fortunate. There was an old man named Granville Calhoun. When I was 10 years old, he was 98, and he lived to be 104. And I would go in downtown Bryson City when he was 98. He would be sitting on his front porch, and I would go sit and talk with him, and he would tell me all about how he grew up on Hazel Creek and how Horace Kephart came there and how he met Kephart and kept Kephart from drinking himself to death, and just all these great stories. And I was so fortunate to be able to spend time with him. And I've got his billfold, his fishing rod, his pistol, bunch of old stuff, that means a lot to me. But my uncle ran the railroad depot in Bryson City from 1924 until 1966. And when he retired, and of course that's the Great Smoky Mountains Railroad now. When you go there and ride the train, that's where it is. But at that time, that was still Southern Railroad. So, and Will Sandlin, who was my aunt, ran the Indian Museum. She was a Sandlin, her maiden name, and her grandfather, Will Sandlin, was a big builder on the Great Smoky Mountains Expressway. He and his brother, part of building the railroad was they made nitro mash, which is nitroglycerin, to blow up tunnels. But it was homemade and it was cheaper than buying nitroglycerin, so they kept a guy to do that, and he had a shed just away from everything, so in case if he blew up, it didn't blow everybody up. And somehow or the other, he must have been a nut, because I guess he had to be a nut to do something like that. My relative, Will Sandlin, convinced him to teach him how to do it when he was 10 years old. And Will's thinking was that he and his brother were selling chestnuts, and that rather than just gathering chestnuts off the ground, if they just blew the tree up, the whole thing would come down, So they put them up a batch of nitro mash and blew a huge chestnut tree up. They said it blew a hole in the ground the size of a football field, and blew both of them 20, 30 feet in the air, and didn't hurt them. They got hurt when their daddy beat their butt, but yeah, that's just just story after story like that you grow up hearing and seeing and that sort of thing. So I was real fortunate in that, and that's really what got me doing all this was because I never would have written a book and didn't. I woke up one day and everybody who knew anything about the Plott hounds were dead pretty much as far as family. And George Ellison, a friend of mine in Bryson City, a really good writer and artist, had just badgered me to write a book. And I'm like, I can't write a book, Who's going to read it? Well, write about what you know. Write a story about the Plott hound. Nobody's done that. And I'm like, yeah. And finally, just to shut him up, I said, I tell you, if you get me my ego won't allow me being rejected by all these publishers. So you just go ahead and get me a proposal on a contract and I will write it. Thinking that would be never happen. About 2 weeks later, he calls me and says, "Did you get your proposal in the mail yet?" And I was like, "Nope, don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "Well, be looking for it." Sure enough, next day, proposal comes from History Press, offer me a contract for this book. And so I wrote it. And of course, I told him, I said, "I've never done this before." And they provide a copy editor for you. I said, "I want you to edit it for me before I send it to them because I don't want to look really stupid." And he said, "Okay." Well, first he didn't say okay first. First he just kind of hesitated and he said, I don't know whether I want to do that or not. And I said, "Well, why not? You're my friend." And he goes, "Well, I've lost friends over this." He said, "Because people can't take this constructive criticism. They just can't take it." I said, "Man, I fought professionally, in the ring. I've taken a beating. You can't hurt me, this is good, So I finished the book, sent it to him. He tells me, be at my office in Bryson City, 8 o'clock on Friday morning. I get there, I'm driving up there, I'm thinking, man, it's going to be a good day. We're going to go in there and we're going to look at this and take a couple hours. We'll go up on Deep Creek, hike up in the park, spend the day having fun. I'll probably be home by dark. I left there at 10 o'clock that night. There was not one page on there wasn't a red mark on. And it wasn't stupid stuff. It wasn't punctuation. It wasn't a misspelled word. It was just, he was such a good writer that he would say, that sentence right there is a good sentence, but if you took the last two words and put them made them the first two words and rewrote that, it'd be so much better. And he was right, So now I'm just completely humiliated. I'm completely, devastated. I'm walking out, this is the worst beating I've ever taken in my life. I'm tired. I'm like, and more than anything, I was embarrassed. And I told him, I said, man, he's not, don't feel bad about this because he said, your second book, when I edit it, he said, it'll take about 2 hours, maybe 3. And I go, there ain't gonna be no second book. And he's like, no, there will be. And he says, and it'll take about 2 hours, 3 hours. He said, your third book, he said, it'll take about an hour. He said, after that, you won't need me. And I thought, well, we'll see. But he was right. That's exactly how it turned out. The second book took me about 2 hours, 3 hours maybe. Third book was not even much more than an hour. And then after that, it was just he'd look at it and say, it's good, go with it,
7 books later.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. He said, I guess he was kind of making a joke, but he's probably serious. He said, sometimes I feel like Dr. Frankenstein. He said, I created a monster because, you put this book out in 2007 and boom, you put out 5 more in the span of about 8 years, But he was something else.